But for now, why don't we take a break from Biden's infrastructure bill and talk a little bit about foreign policy?
Oh, yes. Yes, Hannah, because Bolivia, our old friend, is back in the news. And we've covered Bolivia extensively on this show, but in case you need a quick recap, back in October of 2019, Bolivia held an election in which Evo Morales, Bolivia's first ever indigenous president and a titan of the left-wing pink tide movement in Latin America, won pretty handily. However, the OAS claimed that there were irregularities in the vote. The U.S. agreed, of course, and the Bolivian military stepped in to remove Morales from power, and a woman named Jeanine Áñez assumed the presidency. Áñez was a little-known far-right politician at the time who did not run in the election, but after the military's intervention, she was now the president. She then proceeded to lead a brutal repression of Morales' supporters, which led to several dozen deaths, and took legal steps to bar leaders of Morales' party from running.
While in power, Áñez was accused of siding with security forces to shut down dissent.
She came to power undemocratically, and within her first week, she oversaw 2 different massacres and offered immunity to the soldiers that carried out the massacres, and for the next year carried out a slew of human rights abuses.
Yeah, it's your classic right-wing military coup. And then the Bolivian people, through their large trade union movement, resisted the coup, called a series of general strikes, and forced Áñez to hold new elections, which she promptly lost. And Luis Arce, a former Morales deputy, won and is now the president. Naturally, the new government wants justice for the perpetrators of the violent coup, and they arrested Jeanine Áñez for her role in it.
4 months ago, Jeanine Áñez was president of Bolivia. Now she's under arrest, accused of staging a coup against her predecessor, Evo Morales. Shortly after being detained in the city of Trinidad, she was flown to the capital, La Paz, to face charges of terrorism, sedition, and conspiracy.
Now, this seems pretty straightforward. You do a right-wing coup, you incite violence, you kill a bunch of people, and then you face justice for it. But not to the U.S. government and their mouthpieces in the press. Shortly after the news of Áñez's arrest came out, Joe Biden's new Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, tweeted this, quote, "We are deeply concerned by growing signs of anti-democratic behavior and politicization of the legal system in Bolivia. The Bolivian government should release detained former officials pending an independent and transparent inquiry into human rights and due process concerns." This came shortly after a stunning Washington Post editorial that said, quote, "Mr. Arce had pledged to govern on the basis of unity and conciliation. Thus did Bolivia appear to exit a crisis that the leader of Mr. Arce's party, former President Evo Morales, precipitated by attempting to steal a 4th term through election fraud in 2019, leading to often violent demonstrations, the military's abandonment of the Morales-led government, nice euphemism there, and Mr. Morales' departure to exile." I say stunning, not because I don't think that the Washington Post editorial page is a mouthpiece for the U.S. State Department, which it is, but stunning because it was the Washington Post itself that first questioned the OAS narrative in the U.S. media that Evo Morales stole that election in 2019. In February of 2020, 5 months after the election and subsequent coup, the Washington Post did an independent analysis of the election numbers and the OAS report. They concluded, quote, "Our results were straightforward. There does not seem to be a statistically significant difference in the margin before and after the halt of the preliminary vote. Instead, it is highly likely that Morales surpassed the 10 percentage point margin in the first round." So yeah, you don't get a better example of the U.S. media being used as an instrument for state power. The journalists say one thing, the op-ed writers say another. But it also shows a stunning double standard. Here's that WAPO editorial again. Quote, "Now, unfortunately, Mr. Arce appears to have reverted to a more one-sided and vengeful leadership style characteristic of Mr. Morales, who has returned to Bolivia and still wields considerable power." Ooh. On March 13th, the government jailed Ms. Áñez and 2 former members of her cabinet, threatening them with persecution and long-term prison terms. Warrants are out for several other former top officials. These actions follow an amnesty for Mr. Morales' supporters accused of human rights violations while Mrs. Áñez was in power, as well as the institution of de facto political loyalty tests for key government employees. Oh, yeah, I like my ministers to, agree with me politically. I don't need a team of rivals. Now, when Jeanine Áñez took power, She did the exact same thing that the Washington Post is accusing Luis Arce of doing.
Just a month ago, Evo Morales was Bolivia's head of state. He was forced out after being accused of rigging a presidential election. Now he's in exile in Argentina, and Bolivian police have formally accused him of promoting clashes between law enforcement and his supporters. On Twitter, Interior Minister Arturo Murillo taunted him with a picture of his arrest warrant. And Morales' successor, interim President Jeanine Áñez, has previously said if he returns to Bolivia, he would have to face trial.
If he wants to return to Bolivia, he knows he has to give answers to the country and he has to account for himself before the justice system and face the consequences.
Now, this assessment also was written in the pages of the Washington Post. They wrote, quote, "The military-installed government charged Morales with sedition and terrorism. A European Union monitoring report noted that some 40 former electoral officials have been arrested and face criminal charges of sedition and subversion, and 35 people have died in the post-electoral conflict." But the Washington Post editorial page said nothing then, not a peep, no concern for democracy or human rights or due process in Bolivia when it was a right-wing coup government attacking the left. So what is going on here? Well, you would have thought that the new Biden administration would want to distance itself from Trump's foreign policy. But that's not really how U.S. foreign policy works. It is remarkably consistent no matter who is in power at any given moment. Let's go back to the new Secretary of State's Twitter feed. On April Fool's Day, he tweeted, quote, "It's about holding up the international rules-based system that all of us have invested so much into over the last 75 years, and it has served our interests and our values very well." And of course, that tweet is laughable for those of us on the left, but Blinken was being honest. The U.S., in many ways, created the so-called international rules-based system. Here's according to a piece in The Nation from 2015. The U.S. is a country that, more than any other, nurtured the idea and wrote the rules for an international community of nations governed by the rule of law. At the first Hague Peace Conference in 1899, the U.S. delegate Andrew Dixon White, the founder of Cornell University, pushed for the creation of a permanent court of arbitration and persuaded Andrew Carnegie to build the monumental Peace Palace at The Hague as its home. At the Second Hague Conference in 1907, the Secretary of State Elihu Root urged that future international conflicts be resolved by a court of professional jurists, an idea first realized when the Permanent Court of International Justice was established in 1920. After World War II, the U.S. used its triumph to help create the United Nations, push for the adoption of its Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and ratify the Geneva Conventions for humanitarian treatment in war. If you throw in other American-backed initiatives like the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, and the World Bank, you pretty much have the entire infrastructure of what we now casually call the international community. The thing is, the United States really pushed to create all that, and then proceeded to immediately ignore it. The official U.S. policy for 75 years has been international rules-based system for thee, but not for me. And as Blinken said on that April Fool's tweet, it has served the U.S. very well. Perhaps the clearest example of this U.S. policy towards is the U.S. policy towards the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court was established in 2002 and was meant to be a tribunal that would bring justice to war criminals. But as soon as it was created, the United States undermined its authority. Quote, "Once the newly established International Criminal Court, or ICC, convened at The Hague in 2002, the Bush White House unsigned or de-signed the UN agreement creating the court and then mounted a sustained diplomatic effort to immunize U.S. military operations from its writ. This was an extraordinary abdication for the nation that had breathed the concept of an international tribunal into being." And this is still U.S. policy today. It remained throughout the administrations of Bush, Obama, Trump, and now Biden. Here's Secretary of State Blinken again on his Twitter feed. He wrote, "Today, POTUS removed sanctions previously imposed against the International Criminal Court personnel. The U.S. maintains our position to the the U.S. maintains our opposition to the ICC's attempts to exercise jurisdiction over personnel of non-states parties, such as the United States and Israel." He then followed up that tweet with, "We believe a more effective approach to reform includes engagement to help the ICC achieve its core mission of accountability for atrocity crimes." In other words, We love the International Criminal Court. We're going to reverse the Trump policy of sanctioning the court's personnel. We believe that atrocities and crimes deserve accountability. Just don't dare come for us or Israel. It's really that brazen. They don't even bother to provide some sort of explanation. It's just, we're more powerful, fuck you. Which brings us back to Bolivia. According to Cindy Forster in Jacobin, the woman who launched the criminal lawsuit against the heads of the coup government is Lydia Patti. She filed a case against several figures, among them a key leader of right-wing paramilitary initiatives, Luis Fernando Camacho, the sinister Arturo Murillo, the former head of the police, and Áñez's former minister and personal assistant, Yerko Núñez. An indigenous Quechua woman and elected senator in the mass government, Patti was among those who refused to resign with the coup. On March 15th, Patti spoke on public radio and television networks. There were tortures. Protesters had their fingers cut off. Women in the protests were manhandled by the soldiers, their intimate parts groped, just like in colonial times. In the jail cells, our sisters were raped. She spoke of the coup regime's racism towards indigenous and peasant representatives in parliament, where they were told, "You are our domestics, and go home to your kitchens." When she left office after her term in 2020, Patti chose to file the lawsuit as a private citizen against Áñez. Contrast this with the United States, who is condemning the arrest of Áñez and her cronies. According to the words of our Secretary of State, the U.S. is very concerned with the growing anti-democratic behavior and politicization of the legal system in Bolivia. We care about human rights and due process concerns. The United States is concerned with due process. This is coming from the government that jails more of its people than any other nation in the world, that often holds people in jail without trial for several years, that still operates Guantanamo Bay, which still holds 40 prisoners with no hope of ever being given a trial, let alone being released, a nation that carried out torture and still reserves the right to drone bomb anyone, anywhere in the world for any reason at all. I could go on and on. When the United States talks about human rights, it is always, always, always a cynical ploy to discipline countries that don't adhere totally to the United States' will. Most of the time, the crime those countries actually commit is trying to use their wealth to aid their own poor rather than the American capitalist class.
Obviously, everything that you outlined in your segment today is correct. And, it's interesting to see the commentary coming from Democrats about how different Biden's administration is going to be from that of Barack Obama's. But if you really look at foreign policy and how it's not just something that impacts other countries. Foreign policy has a very close tie to what we're experiencing at home with immigration, with militarized police departments across the country. If Biden's unwilling to change the course on U.S. foreign policy, then a lot of the fundamental issues that we have in this country will remain unchanged. As you know, like the funding that we put into the military leads to an insane inventory of weaponry. And then when they have a surplus of that weaponry, it ends up getting sold to local police departments, and that weaponry gets used against us. When it comes to the crisis at the border, that is obviously something that's driven by the type of meddling that you outlined, Nando, overthrowing democratically elected leaders, especially in Latin American countries, destabilizing these countries, and then pretending as if we're surprised when we have an influx of migrants seeking asylum in the United States. All of these things are tied together. And, as you talk about the reaction to Áñez getting arrested, I couldn't help but think about, Venezuela and the fact that, Maduro, I always wonder, how is it that Maduro just lets Juan Guaido roam about freely?
Yeah.
Who does that? And maybe it's because he knows what the reaction from the United States would be if he took any action against Guaido. I don't know. But for all of the fear mongering we hear about people like Maduro, just again, keep in mind that Juan Guaido, who has attempted multiple coups in his country, just walks about
not just that,
freely.
calls himself the president and is recognized by several Western governments, including the United States, as the official president of Venezuela. It's amazing. The U.S. policy, both under Trump and Biden, is that Juan Guaido is the elected leader of Venezuela. That is official U.S. policy. The actual elected leader of Venezuela, Maduro allows this to just happen in his country. Allows him to just traipse around and give press conferences and things like that. It's just, the supposedly authoritarian, Maduro is just allowing a guy who calls himself the president and is recognized by Western governments as the president to just live his life. It's really quite remarkable.
And whether you're talking about Jeanine Áñez or Juan Guaido, what stands out is this, sense of entitlement and just how brazen they are. And so when there happens to be consequences for being the, face and the leader of a US-backed coup, there's like shock and awe that there would be any consequences. But, obviously, considering the massacres that took place due to Áñez and that coup, yeah, there's going to be consequences. It's shocking that they didn't expect that. And I just wanted to quickly, briefly mention the two things to also look at in regard to foreign policy moving forward. Well, one of the main things I would say is China, because the rhetoric and so far the actions of the Biden administration toward China remain unchanged from what we saw under the Trump administration. And as China continues to accumulate its power, as it unquestionably will become the most powerful country in the world, the United States is going to have its temper tantrum. And that's pretty terrifying because China is not a country that we should be messing with, right? And if anything, if we're serious about doing something about climate control, climate change, you're not going to be able to do that unilaterally. Yes, the United States produces the most CO2 emissions, and obviously our actions matter, but we need to work with other countries, including China, in order to get that situation under control. We can't do it unilaterally. So using, antagonistic rhetoric toward China, I don't think is going to play out well. It's just amazing. On one hand, you have, powerful people in this country saying we don't need to spend money on infrastructure. And then on the other hand, you have all the fear mongering about China and how they're kicking our ass. But we'll talk about that with Seth Ackerman in just a minute. And then Iran. We're not going to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal. It's just not going to happen because Biden wants concessions from Iran before even considering rejoining the Iran nuclear deal. But we're the ones who pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. So why would we demand
murdered their guy
and murdered their top general? Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. No.
So these are all things to keep in mind. The Biden administration's foreign policy so far has been pretty terrible. It's just a continuation of what we've been experiencing for decades. And for anyone who thinks that doesn't matter for domestic policy, you're wrong. All of this stuff is intertwined. All of it is related.